Hey there, this is Natalie, and if you saw my last video, then, I was in a pretty bad mood and a pretty bad situation when I posted that. Sadly, I'm still in a bad mood and a bad situation, so this video is going to be about something that you really need to be in a bad mood to confront, and that is the continuation of looking at Lily Orchard's terrible writing advice. As with my first video about this, I'm going to be going through these unscripted and just talking about each of Lily Orchard's writing tips and what my own thoughts are on them. I covered the first 30 in a previous video, and I have no idea how many I'm going to get through in this session, but I do find I have quite a lot of things to say when I see these kinds of tips. So I'd be very surprised if this ends up being the last video in the series. Just as a quick point before I get into talking about the various tips, Lily Orchard is now going by a different name on YouTube, which is CD Call. And the rebrand of what was the Lily Orchard channel seems to sort of aim to make it look like a cute, silly channel about cartoons. But it is still the same person behind it, as all of those things that we hear Lily Orchard allegedly has allegedly done. The things Lily has allegedly done are probably not going to come up very much in this video because that's really not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the writing stuff. But if you are curious about Lily's history, then there are definitely some very deep dive style videos going into all of that, and you're welcome to go and check those out if you want more context around the person who prescribes these frankly terrible writing tips. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get into the tips. So let's pick up where I left off in the previous Lily Orchard video with tip number 31. World building is like salt. A pinch can make it better. 10 cups of it will not. Now, I would probably put this under the kind of innocuous tip that a very basic person might find useful, but most people would already have thought of by themselves. The amount of world building you include in a work of fiction is going to depend on the demands of the story and the audience. There are certain stories where a lot of world building really brings the setting and the epicness of something to life, makes everything more believable, and really makes the world that you've created feel quite lived in. But even when you're writing something quite short, even in a setting where, you can assume that people understand already quite a lot about the setting, for instance, a contemporary setting like a workplace or a school, you still do need to do some form of world building. This is so you don't end up with the kind of thing where, you have the billionaire love interest who works at the business factory and you don't actually know what his company does or how he spends any of his time when he's not with the love interest character. This makes the story feel completely bland and stupid, and is something that you can probably get away with if you're writing throwaway popcorn type fiction, but it would still make it better if you went a little bit further. Say you're doing a high school setting. Yes, everybody knows what a high school is like. You don't need to necessarily go into the timetables of all the students and what facilities are on the grounds if they're not going to come up in any of the scenes that you're going to have. But putting some stuff in about the history of the school, or the type of neighborhood it's in, the kind of people it attracts, what kind of things the students get up to, if there are clubs, if there's a student council, all of that kind of stuff. Even if it doesn't play into the plot that much, or if you're doing a slice of life type thing, it doesn't play into any of the scenarios you really want to explore, it still makes it feel like a real setting, rather than, okay, I just want to put these situations into a generic place where, anybody can relate to it, that actually ends up being inferior, no matter how strong the characters actually are or the situations that you create are. To use an example that Lily Orchard loves using for some reason, take Friends. Yeah, Friends, we know they live in an apartment and they go to a coffee house and they've all got various jobs and all that sort of thing. But the situations where they are hanging out in the coffee shop, it makes more sense and adds something to the feel of their lives that you get from watching the show, that the coffee house has a name and staff that we see occasionally as bit part characters. These kind of things would be considered world building, even though you might think you don't need to do any world building when you're using a familiar contemporary setting. Now, when you get into fantasy or sci-fi, the kind of settings where you do need at least some world building, no matter how small the scope of the story, simply because the setting is not one that you can make any kind of assumptions about based on the reader's own life. You can go as into world building as you like, really, though it's finding the right opportunities to incorporate it that stops it from feeling like boring detail that the reader doesn't really need and instead enriches the story. So talking about different countries in the world that you've created makes more sense when somebody is exploring those countries or meeting people from those countries, or there's plot points involving relations with other nations and that sort of thing, rather than just giving a big old exposition dump about all of the continents in the planet that you've created or something like that, and their various political structures and histories. You may not even know all of those things going into creating the story. You may not know when you start the story exactly which places your character is going to journey to. If you do, then putting a bit of foreshadowing in terms of this place exists and we may find out more about it later can be very good. A story that does this a lot is Mushoku Tensei, one that I talk about a lot on my channel, and that is one of the Japanese light novel series best known for having exceptionally good world building. I think part of what makes it good is that the world building is all there to explain any questions you might have about the series and to make it feel real and lived in as a world. But it also doesn't feel like you're reading a kind of Bible or history book about a place that doesn't exist. All of the things that you discover are very much centered around events and people and things that will play into the experiences of the characters that we're following. If world building isn't something you're particularly interested in doing in your series to that kind of degree, and you really want to stick to the immediate surroundings of the plot and, the backstories and histories of the people that we're going to actually encounter, that's fine too. But you have to make sure there's enough world building there to answer at least the most fundamental questions that somebody's going to have about your setting. A good example of this being done badly is High Guardian Spice, a series I have also talked about on my channel, which at no point actually tells you what a guardian even is and what their role in the world is, even though the whole thing is it's a story about girls going to a special school to learn how to be guardians. Now, if your thoughts about world building are so slim that you haven't really even established what the purpose of your characters is in the world and how that would integrate with the rest of that kind of society that supposedly exists, it can be very hard for people to really get on board with anything that you're telling them. So even if your fantasy story is going to stay fixed on just a few locations and you're not really going for the epic kind of Lord of the Rings or A Song of Ice and Fire type world where there's information to be found about everything, you do still have to consider how things actually work in your setting, and that will play into things like your magic systems or the technology that you have. These things are going to be important in any kind of fantasy story. So even if it's a small scale thing about a girl going to witch school, you still need to do some world building there. And if you really don't want to do even that, then you have to question whether or not you might actually prefer to be writing in a different genre where you don't have to create all of that from scratch, and you might prefer to put those characters into something that you can do the more minimal sort of contemporary type world building to suit. So maybe you shouldn't be writing fantasy in the first place. Maybe you shouldn't be trying to create a civilization from scratch that's going to have all of these stories take place in it. And maybe you really want to write a story set in an office or a high school or any kind of workplace type normal situation where all of the world building you really have to do is just establishing the things that affect the day-to-day lives of your characters, because everything else about the world can just be taken from real life. Lily's tip number 32 is characters should always come before anything else. Now, this one is the kind of thing you see writers say a lot of the time, and I think it's one of those sort of basic bitch kind of takes, because although it is in some ways true, because the characters are what we experience stories through, and therefore focusing on them is never a bad idea. If you give it some thought, there are certainly times and genres where something else would actually take precedence over the characters in terms of how you approach writing. One example would be any kind of speculative fiction. If you're writing something like, say, an episode of Black Mirror or a short science fiction story that really aims to explore a particular concept and how that would affect people or how it would affect society in general, the concept is the most important thing, and the consequences of the concept are the most important thing. The characters, you may choose to make them kind of everyman type characters that people can relate to and will want to follow through the story, but who they're not really going to remember as an all-time great character that they sort of found really engaging and interesting, because that would actually take away from the high concept thing that you're trying to do. Somebody particularly exceptional or interesting who was engaging in a way that, you know, your blank slate kind of everyman character never really can be, would give you a degree of separation from the effects of the scenario that you've created, in that you'd be thinking, well, that's how this person would react to that, but this person is unusual, this person is unique in these ways, and so it's not really giving the picture of this is how this would affect a lot of people, or this is why this concept is disturbing, or this is why this concept is interesting to explore. And it can also be the case with things like horror. You really want to explore the primal human thing of being afraid and the things that create those fears. And so having a character who is pretty uninteresting as a person can actually emphasize that, you know, you're not thinking, oh, this character is traumatized by this horrible thing because of all these things we know happen to them that make them interesting and make them someone we perhaps sympathize with. Instead, we want to feel like anybody in this horrifying situation that the author has created would feel this terror. So there are certainly times when the character isn't the main point, and being on board with the characters may still be necessary, but it doesn't pay to have those characters really shine, if you know what I mean. You can also find that some sort of stories, the mysteries in the story, mysteries about the world, the setting, mysteries about what other characters are doing behind the scenes, the revelations, the things that the reader might theorize about. Classic example being the murder mystery genre, but this can apply to all kinds of other things too. That can also be a time when you need to put more thought into the mysteries than the people solving them. That's not to say you don't want to have interesting characters, exploring these situations and discovering the answers to the mysteries, but the thing the reader is really engaging with is either they're hoping for a very clever and exciting revelation that really the author has created something surprising and fun or interesting or shocking, or they're trying to solve the mystery alongside the character and they want to feel like they can do that. You need to put more thought into the mystery and the clues and the foreshadowing and how difficult or easy you make it for somebody reading it to predict what's going to happen. Those things are going to be your priority in those kinds of works of fiction over, yes, I'm going to make this character that people particularly enjoy. Also, I think when you think about character and nothing else to start with, you want to write a story about a really interesting character. This works if you're trying to do something that is going to be quite formulaic. You're going to do a typical romance novel. The characters of the main couple in your romance novel are the thing that the person reading it is going to need to latch onto, because the story is going to follow that formula that you get in all romance novels, and it needs to follow that formula, otherwise it's deviating from the genre and becoming a different genre. You can write a love story that doesn't follow the rules of romance, but you can't write a romance novel that would be published by one of the big romance publishing brands without having certain features always occur. So where you have to be creative and engage your audience is with the strength of the characters. But other than in those cases, it is quite rare that you'll come up with the character before you come up with a premise or a concept that you want to write a story about, or a mystery that you want to have take place. It's usual in a lot of genres of fiction that you might come up with a concept or an idea, and then you start thinking, what type of person would it be most interesting to see this all happen to? And that's absolutely fine. That's perfectly reasonable way to create good characters. You create the right person for your story when you already have at least some idea of what the point of the story is, or what the plot of the story is going to be. It's unusual to sort of think, I just have this idea of this really cool character and I want to write a series about them because they're awesome. It's not something that is approached that way in a lot of genres and by a lot of people. So if you have an idea for a really cool character and you're just trying to think of the right story for them, or you want to put them into sort of a series of low stakes kind of slice of life type stories, that's absolutely fine. But if you're starting sort of with a blank and you don't really know what you want to write, it would make more sense to pick a genre, pick a concept. For instance, say you want to write an isekai story. Usually there will these days be some kind of hook that you would put into that, rather than just, I want to write a story about someone transported to another world. It's what's the concept of either what type of person is being transported to another world and why are they interesting, or what happens in that other world that is interesting or unusual. Are they turned into a vending machine or a sword? Are they turned into a super overpowered character, or one that doesn't have any abilities and is disadvantaged? Is the setting unusual, or is it a typical fantasy setting? You can decide all of those things and then think, okay, so what actual personality would it be interesting to see go through this story? And then you build your character up like that. I think we have a tendency as consumers of fiction to, because we really enjoy the best written characters and we love them so much, we tend to kind of think that you have to create that kind of character from day one of writing your story. You have to have in mind this person who is going to really interest and appeal to your audience and is going to be a character that they'll remember forever. And that isn't the way that imagining characters usually begins. And if you try to force it, if you try to think, how can I make a really cool, really likable, really interesting person, you tend to get into the Mary Sue kind of territory where he's just so great and awesome because he can do all of these things and he's funny, and you end up kind of trying to force the coolness, or you follow the usual kind of advice and, oh, well, he's got to have some flaws, or she's got to have some flaws, and I've got to come up with, reasons why they're not a Mary Sue, and then I've got to come up with reasons why people will sympathise with them and all of this stuff. Actually, normally it's better to sort of think, what type of person would be interesting to have confront these situations? What kind of person would be interesting to have interact with this person? And then you can sort of build it from there. You can give them some interesting quirks. You can, play around with their dialogue, their appearance, whatever you want to do to begin to make them into a real fleshed out character, rather than just that kind of spark of, okay, it would be interesting to see a very logical and shy person confront this situation. How would they do it? Or it would be interesting to see a criminal reform in this way. You think of those kind of things, and then you turn that basic outline of a character into a real person as you go through, as they interact with other characters, and that is ultimately what makes them into the kind of character that people will remember. They don't have to march into your head fully formed, is what I'm saying. Even though it can feel like, how could I ever create a character as memorable or as, likable as my favourites? It's really easier to think of those things from a kind of constructive process, rather than just expecting your imagination to fart out something perfect that you can then somehow convey in your story. So those first two really were kind of innocuous but basic, and ones where I think if you put a little bit more thought into it, you can actually find a lot of exceptions, and also find ways that you can apply to your own writing that don't require you to kind of meet those strange standards of your characters must be the most important thing, or world building must be perfectly balanced in every case. You often won't know very much about those things when you first start a new story. And it's fine for the way you approach them to develop as you write that story. Remember, there's only so much you can put across to the reader at the start of your story, so having it all figured out in advance isn't necessary. It's more something to monitor as you're going through. Am I introducing the world building at the right time? Am I doing enough of it? Am I developing this character sufficiently for the type of story this is? Am I perhaps making them a little bit too eccentric or interesting for the type of story I'm trying to tell, if it's a story that is more in the kind of speculative kind of realm? But now let's look at number 33, The protagonist should be a protagonist, not just a vessel for the antagonist to hog the story. If you're going to make a villain protagonist, just open with that. Now, this is one of the tips that we saw quite a few of in the previous video, in the first 30 of Lily's tips, where it seems like she's kind of vaguely criticizing something that she's seen or engaged with that she didn't like and wants to kind of vague post about the reasons why it didn't work for her. I think that in most cases, if someone wants to write a villain protagonist, they will write a villain protagonist. If they want to write a story that's fairly balanced between the protagonist and the antagonist, they can do that too. It's really not usually the case that someone comes up with a really cool villain and they're the most interesting thing in the story, but they need to focus on someone who's going up against them just for the sake of it. That's, not something you see very often, but I don't really see any reason why it matters. The balance between how much focus there is on your protagonist and your antagonist is completely down to what you think works for conveying that conflict. In some cases, you may have an antagonist who is going to end up later on in the series joining forces with the protagonist. That's pretty common in a lot of anime, and so focusing a lot on them during that initial portion where they are the bad guy, so that we can see more about how they operate, what their reasons for doing things are. That's all fine and good if that person's later going to become a major factor in the core group that we're following through the story. I think the balance between protagonist and antagonist is also something that gets a bit muddied when, instead of thinking about protagonist, antagonist, what you really mean is hero and villain. The antagonist in a story can be anybody who's opposing what the protagonist wants to achieve. The antagonist in a story about a teenager trying to sneak out for the evening is their parents. That's not because they're the antagonists in that person's life, but they are the obstacle to them getting out and doing what they want to do. The antagonist isn't always the villain. We have to stop thinking in these kind of cartoonish terms if we're trying to break down how to actually construct fiction. And Lily really only watches cartoons from, what I've seen of the channel, and believes that all fiction needs to kind of work in terms of the rules that you'd like to see in children's cartoons, where heroism should be, and often is, the relatable and aspirational aspect of the story. Now, that's sometimes the case in other forms of fiction, but any kind of conflict isn't really about heroes and villains when you get down to it at a more kind of sophisticated level than He-Man versus Skeletor or whatever. And the protagonist, antagonist, deuteragonist roles may shift in a long story. That's something that you may see. Some stories have multiple protagonists. You can't really say who the protagonist of A Song of Ice and Fire is. And each of the characters has their own antagonists. So, it's a very basic way of looking at story crafting that I don't think you can take to that level of you must always focus on the protagonist above the antagonist at every stage of the story, in every situation that is explained in the story. You must balance the screen time in this way. I don't think you can extrapolate that from who is the hero and who is the villain, who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist. It just seems like something where Lily's found a story she didn't like because they spent too much time focusing on the villain, and Lily believes that that author should have written a villain protagonist instead. I don't know. It's not very useful anyway. But this next one is one that I would say was actually absolute bollocks. and one that you absolutely shouldn't take as any kind of advice if it contradicts the way that you wanted to write your story. And that's number 34. Perspective shifts are a staple of storytelling. Having only one perspective isn't a stylistic choice. It's just crap. Nope. It can be a stylistic choice if you're going for something like, say you're doing something character-driven in the literary sense, which is something people get very confused. People normally say, oh, my story is character-driven because my characters have agency and everything happens because my characters want it to, and that's how characters should be, and that's what makes a good story. That's not really what character-driven means. Those stories are often still usually plot-driven. The characters just have high agency. Things that are truly character-driven are normally found more in the realms of literary fiction and sometimes in comedy. But in literary fiction, it tends to be stories where the plot isn't really important. There isn't even necessarily a beginning, middle, and end. There may not even be an arc that the character goes through. It is instead more of a study of a type of person that the main character is, or the main group of characters are, and the things that transpire because of the way they are. So something like American Psycho would be a truly character-driven book because it's all told from the perspective of someone who is completely insane, and the experience is one of not necessarily following a story with any particular ending. You know, he doesn't get caught in the end, he doesn't change in any particular way, he more just spirals and gets worse and worse. But the experience is one of what's it like inside the mind of this particularly crazy person. Other stories like The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway, it's just a bunch of people sort of travelling around and doing stuff. There isn't really a story per se, but it's a study of the type of people they are at that time in their lives. A more modern equivalent would be something like Generation X by Douglas Coupland. These are all very focused on the type of people that exist in the work of fiction. I don't even know that you would necessarily even call it a story. It's more just a study of what these people are like and what it would be like to be with them in these moments. If you're trying to do something like that, then it is very much a stylistic choice to only view things through the perspective of that character or that group of characters, because the things that are going on in the world around them and the reactions that other people have to them are kind of, the reader is the person that's reacting to them. It's not really necessary to see other people's perspectives on them, because the reader's role then is to have their own perspective on that character. It can also be a stylistic choice if you want to use something like, say, an unreliable narrator. There are other times when it's not a stylistic choice, it's just the best way of putting across the plot. For instance, it can be quite normal that you don't want the reader to know anything that the protagonist doesn't know. Any kind of mystery story, stories that are heavy on mystery in general, even if they're not particularly mystery stories. So something like Harry Potter, it's rare, it only really happens a few times in the later books, that the reader knows anything that Harry doesn't. Usually you're exposed to new information only at the time that he finds it out. Usually you only find out what other characters think about things when they say them to Harry. So the reader has the experience of anything that's a surprise to Harry, anything that's a twist to that character is a twist to them. If you told everything from all different perspectives and saw lots of scenes where he wasn't there, so you know a lot of conversations that went on that he wasn't party to, or you know about some schemes that are going on that he's not aware of, that actually changes the feel of going through that story. And it is used sparingly in the last few books. There are a few scenes where you have some information about what the Prime Minister is doing that none of the protagonists really know about. There's scenes where you find out that Draco is going to be trying to kill Dumbledore, which Harry doesn't know for that book. But that sort of thing is only introduced very much later on, and with a view to creating more mystery for the reader rather than taking away from the experience of the reader finding out what's going on alongside the characters that they're following. So, you know, that's how that kind of thing works. If you were to tell a story like Made in Abyss, but you already showed us the answers to everything that's, you know, what's going on with Rika's mother, what's at the bottom of the abyss, what actually happened to people, what's the history of the abyss, what's everybody that Rika comes across, you know, what are their backstories, what are they scheming, what are they doing. If you switch perspectives all the time and show us all of that, then it takes away the mystery of following this character on their process of discovering the answers to these things. And when the answers to these things are the interesting thing that keeps the reader going, and seeing them alongside the character that's trying to find them out as the plot of the story, you know, by adding in other perspectives, you're not doing anything good. You're basically making the story less exciting, less interesting, and for what gain? Okay, we understand some other characters better, we get some more screen time for some underserved faves or whatever, but that doesn't actually achieve making the story better or making the experience of following it better. So I don't know where Lily got this idea from. I don't know where Lily gets any of Lily's ideas from, but it is very much a poor writing tip. If you're writing something that doesn't really have any constraints, where switching perspectives would make something inferior or take something away from the experience, and you want to do it, and you want to explore what different people think about a situation, you can even switch perspectives within a scene and have what one character feels while they're saying something, then switch to the other character reacting as they hear that. That can be a way of showing someone being lied to, and whether or not the other character knows that they're being lied to, you know, whether or not that lie is effective. In some situations you might want that, you might want the reader to know more than the person telling the lie knows, but in others you might want the character to maybe think that they were successful but the other character actually didn't believe them, or whatever. It's just a very difficult one to argue with, because it's so flawed that I don't know why anyone would think that this was a good tip anyway. I mean, I'm trying to think why Lily thinks this. Is it about variety? Is it about, you know, giving all the characters a voice of their own, or something like that? I don't know. I don't know why anyone would think this was a rule to writing a story, and that stylistically, if you choose to not have perspective shifts, it's crap. I can't really honestly think of what sourced this idea into Lily's mind. It's inevitably going to be some story she watched or read where, you know, it was all first person from a character she didn't like, and she would like to have seen more of other characters, and, you know, that manifests as this crap tip, but it's not one to take to heart. And if you do find yourself experiencing a story like that, you know, where it is told all from one perspective, and you feel that that wasn't the right choice for that story, that's still perfectly valid. I'm not saying that every story should not have perspective shifts. I'm saying that thinking of that as a rule because you've seen it done in a way that was bad or suboptimal before doesn't mean it is inherently an invalid way of approaching writing something. In fact, there are many situations where it's the only way to make the story work the way you want it to. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about just those 3 tips, but the next one isn't going to take quite so long. Number 35. If you're making a cartoon, hire writers. Don't just have your storyboarders write the story. That's not what they're there for. Artists draw, writers write. Artists cannot just take over for the writers on a whim. Again, this is probably some kind of vague posting about a specific cartoon series that Lily's aware of, and I don't care about any of that. I would say, there are certainly people who possess the talents of both writing and creating art. And if that's, someone's skill set, then expecting them to use both of those parts of their skill set in their professional role is perfectly fine. If they only have one or the other skill, then obviously they should only be applying the skill that they have to the project. I don't think there's really anything controversial about that. I don't really know what she's getting on with here, to be honest. So let's just move on to the next one. Number 36. Related to Rule 2, which will be one that I covered in the previous video. Will they, won't they isn't a fun story. It's just addiction peddling. We need to stop pretending Ross and Rachel was good storytelling and learn to appreciate Chandler and Monica and Joey and Rachel. I did mention before that Lily really likes to use Friends as an example for things. I mean, as someone who's old enough that I watched Friends when it very first aired, every week on TV, I found it quite funny. I can still enjoy revisiting, watching it in that kind of, you want to stick something you've seen 100 times on in the background while you're working or doing something else, in that kind of way. But I can't really get on board with thinking of it as a kind of example of peak storytelling across all genres that can be compared to any kind of project someone's trying to work on now. And that to me makes it odd. In fact, another thing about this point that she made is she says we need to learn to appreciate Chandler and Monica and Joey and Rachel. And I think almost universally every critique video I've seen about Friends, everybody does appreciate Chandler and Monica as a storyline, and almost nobody likes Joey and Rachel. The way it was built up to, the chemistry between the characters just never really lent towards a romantic storyline. The romantic storyline didn't last very long, and it really more fed into the ongoing Ross and Rachel storyline than anything else. The Chandler and Monica thing, it was a friends to lovers kind of story that built up over seasons, and the characters had a quite realistic way of working through their problems and learning to be together. That was all fine and good, and good writing. A lot of people think so. The Ross and Rachel thing, it may be one of those kind of storylines where, maybe that couple really weren't that well suited to each other. But that was the way that it happened, and the way that the authors decided to make it end up. And who's to say, that every relationship that you portray in a TV show needs to have everybody end up with the exact perfect person for them. Maybe you can end up being in love with someone who isn't exactly perfect for you, and you do go through a load of drama to get there, and yet you still do end up together and make it work. Maybe that happens sometimes. It's to me, I don't know, will they, won't they? Sometimes it can be boring, and it can feel like it's frustrating thing to have in a series. You just want to get it out of the way, because all the time being focused on teasing a relationship that you know is probably going to be in the end game of the series, it just feels like time spent on something that isn't going to pay off for a long time. And that is true. There are probably more interesting ways to incorporate or develop a romantic relationship than spending too long on that phase where they might get together, they might not. But then there are also will they, won't they kind of stories where that's almost the point. And you know that when they do get together, that's going to be the end. And those can still be very entertaining, particularly in more comedic kind of genres. So if you take something like Kaguya-sama Love is War, that's basically just a will they, won't they the whole way through. Yet, because it's kind of predicated on the fact that both characters see it as kind of they're losing if they confess to the other, and just the humorous things that ensue throughout the series, and the way that other characters around them don't necessarily know what the status of the two of them is, or if anything's going to develop, maybe are feeling the same frustration in some cases as the viewer, thinking, oh, will they please just get a room already? But at the same time, you know that once they get together, that changes, that's the end really, that, now we're moving to a new status quo. That doesn't facilitate the show that we've been watching, the story that we've been watching. Most kinds of stories can progress from a will they, won't they to a now they're in a relationship status quo without that being a problem, because that wasn't the purpose of the story. But if you're doing a romance story where the couple getting together is the end game, moving to that new status quo is really a matter for the epilogue, 5 years later they're married with children or whatever, rather than now we're going to progress and still try and do all the other things that this story was about, but now this couple is together. So, I think will they, won't they is something that, maybe it's overdone. Maybe it's not always that entertaining, particularly in things like long-running sitcoms. But when it's used in the romance genre, particularly in romantic comedies, it can actually be a jumping off point for some quite funny kind of premises and scenarios. Another good example would be Nagatoro-san, one of my favourites from that particular genre. The build-up of the teasing girl kind of genre in general, where the couples seem like antagonistic towards each other at first, but there's this clear thing that the teasing girl is actually interested in the boy and just needs to kind of get over the embarrassment of being young and tsundere, and just that those kind of stories I think are good. They're kind of the only thing getting in the way of the character is their own sort of immaturity and embarrassment, and that leads them to act in a certain way that is quite funny and endearing, and yeah, I like that. But I wouldn't say I was watching week by week or reading those mangas week by week to find out what happens next, will they, won't they, in this episode. It's not really an addiction. It's more just like I'm enjoying the ride of these characters interacting with each other, and whether or not any progress is made in this episode towards them becoming a couple doesn't really matter, because once they become a couple, the series is over and I don't get to have fun watching these characters anymore. So, it's very much a genre thing, but I think ruling it out as being bad always, and there's no reason to it other than, to keep people hooked, is really kind of doing a disservice to the well-written will they, won't they stories that do exist. Now, I know I've actually only covered a few tips so far, but the next block of them all kind of go into a different direction, This set of tips that we've talked about here are really about writing in general, and it's led me to sort of want to talk about misunderstandings about character writing, the importance of characters, ways that different styles are implemented in different genres and things like that I think Lily just doesn't get. And those things kind of apply to the wider world of writing different types of stories and all of that kind of stuff, and were the closest thing to actual writing tips, as bad as they were, in the collection so far. The next block of them are all about things like how different tropes are problematic, things that I think probably I would like to discuss in their own block. So I'm going to end this video with just these few discussed, but I'm going to immediately work on the next one, so it won't be as long as the wait from the first video covering the first 30 tips to this one for you to find out what I think about the next block. But I don't want to sort of make a 5-hour-long video responding to these anyway, and I think the set that I've done in here all kind of go together conceptually in terms of what I want to talk about, along with, you know, what Lily was kind of trying to cover in that set. And the next set is going to go into the more kind of controversial stuff, the more kind of you should have to portray this kind of character in this kind of way, otherwise you're a huge turd kind of stuff she was doing in the tips I covered in the first video, but taken to a more deranged kind of extreme. So look forward to seeing the takes on those coming out very soon. But for now, thank you for listening to all of this. I hope you found it useful or interesting. And also thank you so much to the people who subscribe to my channel and regularly watch my videos. And of course to anybody who's been helping me with things like Patreon and coffee during what has been a very bad time. Yeah, I don't want to go into that too much, considering that was what my last video was all about. So just know that if you've helped me out at all, I am incredibly grateful to you. And if you want to help me out at this point, there are links to my coffee and Patreon in the description, and I am eternally grateful to all of the people who kind of are helping me keep going through this bad time. I look forward to seeing you next time, and thank you so much for listening.